Hi dear, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's such a pleasure to welcome you in this third day of our Wisdom for the Earth Forum. So the forum was created with the intention to build a dialogue between Buddhism and environment. So far we explored the notion of interdependence, trying to connect the dots between climate, chaos, and our own cultural and spiritual representation. And this last day is dedicated to action. So you are the perfect speaker to address the forum about action, because your contribution to create a more sustainable and equitable world is outstanding and has gained international recognition. As founder and director of Local Future, as co-founder of International Forum on Globalization, but also as a writer, a lecturer, a teacher, and a leading proponent of localization, so which will be the main subject of your talk. So welcome, and it's a great pleasure to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. And I have a very holistic, a rather complex, big picture to share. As some of you may know, my activism and my thinking started in Ladakh. And I also worked in Bhutan for over a 5-year period. But the deep, deep knowledge I have comes from 40 years of experience in Ladakh. And as you may know, Ladakh is the westernmost part of Tibet. It lies high on the Tibetan plateau, but it's a region that belongs politically to India. Because Ladakh
Elle voit quoi?
for 8 months of the year, it was quite untouched by colonialism, and even the Christian missionaries who went to Ladakh already from the 1600s had very little influence on this region. So I was very lucky to experience a culture that was still living according to its own development, according to its own values, focused on its own language, and very much guiding its own development and change, not forced change from the outside, which really, with the Western system in particular, starting with Christianity, but particularly with the global economy that was created essentially as the modern economy was invented. It was created as a system that benefited global traders from Europe. And these global traders used force, genocide, slavery, and in Europe, enclosures, pushing people off the land to become cheap labor in the factories that were using cheap resources produced by slaves on the other side of the world. So this system, this global system, has been based on racism, misogyny, and very overt anti-nature sentiment. And I believe that today, the most important thing that could happen is that we would realize how this global system in the past 35 years, in the name of mondialization, in the name of globalization, what's happened is that governments worldwide have caved in to the pressures of global banks and corporations, and they have signed in black and white treaties to say, you run the world. We will not do anything to interfere with your profit. What I'm saying sounds extreme, and I'm not going to be talking much more about globalization tonight, but I hope that some of you will be interested in pursuing this path of a type of big picture activism to understand better how the global system is responsible for poverty. And now we're talking about poverty in the middle classes, even in the upper classes. In the industrialized countries, we're talking about poverty in India and China in the name of growth. The vast majority of people are getting poorer. Governments are getting poorer. All governments are poorer than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, because with globalization, they've allowed global banks and corporations to create wealth and to distribute it to suit their needs. Now, this is why localization, or localizing, is the most urgent and important thing we can do. And as Buddhists, I would like to explain, that my thinking over many years, trying to understand how it was that the Ladakhi people were the happiest people I had ever encountered, how it was that the feminine energy and the peaceful nature of people, the tolerance, how was it possible for people to live in a way that was so harmonious? Now, it was not perfect. It was not a complete paradise because Ladakh didn't have heating in the winter. It didn't have the comfort that we can find in industrial cultures. But I have to say, after 40 years of spending, in the beginning, I was there for half of every year for many years. Later on, it was less. And as I became aware of the need to raise awareness about how the global economy was destroying local economies, local communities, biodiversity, I was traveling more to other parts of the world. But in all those years, I think I came to understand some of the key elements that enabled this culture to be so peaceful and for people to be so happy. And it's systemic. I would argue that when the Buddha brought his teachings to the world, when Buddhism was brought to the world, most people lived in intergenerational communities. In other words, collaboration between the youngest and the oldest and living together was a reality for the majority of people. They also lived with local knowledge systems and with a degree of technology that meant that they did not threaten the lives of other species. They didn't threaten to destroy the entire world with new technologies. They were much more embedded in nature and in community. So what Buddhism did was to help protect that way of life. Buddhism brought in very clear warnings about ways of being, ways of thinking that could lead to the greed and the separation that would give rise to very different ways of living. So what I want to talk about is that the teachings of interdependence in Buddhism, which for me is the fundamental teaching, that nothing exists in isolation. There is no such thing as a separate, static entity that is separate. We are in a web of relationships, and it's a dance, it's a movement. That means, like, if you've studied Nagarjuna, the very early Buddhist philosopher, he's taught that if you believe that everything is so interdependent that it's one, he used the language of saying, you're stupid as a cow. But equally, if you believe that everything is separate, you are stupid as a cow. So the subtle teaching is the understanding that language can't capture this dance of interdependence, and it can't capture the experience we have of oneness when we allow the left brain, the intellectual side of the brain, to just rest, and we sink into a deeper space. We can feel a sense of expanded self and oneness with the universe. And this, I think many spiritual traditions teach that quietness and that type of shutting down the left brain, which is the brain that is constantly separating. And we obviously need to be able to function with that more analytical approach, because that's for every action. When we choose to do something, the left brain comes into play. And of course, as we try to make plans for the future, etc., there is a need for this. But of course, as you probably know and have heard discussed, with modern development, we have overdeveloped this left side of the brain, and we're in danger of actually physically becoming almost incapable of experiencing that sense of oneness, that sense of inner peace. If you haven't heard of Ian McGilchrist, he's an interesting thinker who's relatively recently become known for his study of the brain and the difference between left and right. And I'm sure that there are others also in the French-speaking world. But to come back to how this connects to a whole way of life, a way of life where we are more interdependent, where we actually live in a way where we experience, and this is now at another level from the profoundly philosophical level, at a very practical level, people for most of the time, in most parts of the earth probably, experience a sense of security because every mother had about 10 caretakers for every child. So as people lived in this more extended family, there was never the tiredness, the exhaustion that comes out of the nuclear family, which was entirely a product of a modern economic system that pushed us away from a way of producing, providing for our needs, living in the world, meeting our needs, producing our food, producing our clothes, producing our shelter. All of these activities are fundamental, and they are what we have to describe as the economy. But today, what's called economics has made shadow work, has made invisible the most important activities. There is nothing we do as human beings that's more important than how we rear or bring up our children. There is nothing beyond that that's more important than how we produce our food. Food is the only thing we produce that everybody on the planet needs every day. So what I'm a proponent of is the understanding that we look back to history and we look honestly, and there are more voices now bringing this out. There were many cultures around the world that were able to produce food for centuries, sometimes for thousands of years, without destroying the environment, without destroying, the richness of the soil, without destroying their own health. But we have been hearing that agriculture was the beginning of the fall, that the minute we started doing agriculture, everything went wrong. In the environmental movement, that's been widespread thinking. Now, this is, as I say, being disproven more and more, including by writers about indigenous people in Australia who were for tens of thousands of years actually farming, but farming on a small scale and in a way that was adapted to the local ecosystem. I'm probably being too slow, I realize now. I've got to speed up a bit in what I'm trying to cover. So I do want to say that in this area of localization, as an economic path that goes hand in hand with a Buddhist worldview and with Buddhist values, focusing on shifting the food economy is the most important thing we can do. As I said, how we rear our children is, of course, of fundamental importance too. And both the parenting and the farming in the modern world have been made into unimportant shadow type work. So thinking about how we raise our children is also vitally important. But I would argue that right now, in the world where we are today, focusing on shifting the food economy is the most rapid way to start regaining a balance and to build ways of life that are more conducive to having a parenting, a way of raising children that will be more holistic, that will be more peaceful, that will allow a balance between feminine, nurturing, caring, collaborative values, and, if you like, the more archetypical masculine values, which are also important in balance. But the patriarchal system that we have today has completely squashed the feminine side. And so now we need to be regaining a balance by supporting the feminine. Focusing on local food economies is an amazing win-win strategy. And I know there is quite a lot happening in France. There is around the world quite a lot happening at the grassroots. However, what we need to recognize, if we understand the global economy, if we understand how crazy it is that our governments are still handing over power to global corporations, we will see that there's so much more we need to do to really strengthen local economies by starting with local food economies as the most important. The government support right now is going towards increasing mass transport of food across the world. It is now linked to a picture, a vision of 100% urbanization. It's being marketed as smart green cities. And the smart green cities, which are meant to be run on renewable energy, many people who promote this believe it's the good thing. They believe that it's the only way to provide for the global population without destroying the environment. Tragically, it's because almost no one has looked at the global system, and that includes not understanding that it's the industrial agriculture and even previous civilizations that were growth-oriented and that wanted to conquer the world. What they started doing to agriculture was very destructive, of course. It became too intensive, it was expansionist, and the biggest rupture happened with modernity. So it's particularly since the 1700s that this agricultural domain has become violently destructive. Food has been bred for transport, for profit, not for nutrition. And of course, after the Second World War, with fossil fuels, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, etc., it's become a nightmare. But what people need to be aware of today is that because the handover continues to global corporations, we are talking about banking, we're talking about every avenue of knowledge. This is the most frightening thing, is that in academia, meaning in science, in schooling, in media, big money has been funding development. And these giant corporations have people working in them who are just like you and me, generally. It's not about good guys and bad guys. It's not about ethics. It's not enough to become Buddhist and to meditate and then to go along with a way of thinking that is not looking at this global system. Because now what's happened is that whether it's genetic engineering, whether it's using massive amounts of rare earth minerals to produce robots to replace people, whether it's other incredibly wasteful, polluting, energy-intensive ways of doing things, all of this is coming in now in the name of a Green New Deal. So I'm sorry to be going on about this global system, but it's really important for us to understand why localizing is so vitally important and how we need to start studying and researching ourselves to see that small, diversified farms can produce vastly more per unit of land, per unit of water. But those farms, to be productive and to produce really healthy food and really healthy, keep the soil healthy, to restore ecosystems for wildlife, those farms need lots of people. So there's a way forward, away from robots, away from using more and more minerals, more and more energy to remove people and to use robots. There's a way forward which will actually need more eyes per acre, more hearts, more hands, more care in a community structure. And I'm sure if you haven't already, you'll be able to visit projects in France where this is happening. You'll be able to see how enjoyable that work is for people who are engaged in that on a community level. And I would argue that if they had more information about the global economy and how destructive it is, they would be even more motivated and they would be more proud of what they're doing. Because as you know, being a farmer has not been something that brings a lot of respect. However, despite that, around the world, from Benin to Costa Rica, to Peru, to America, to France, to Australia, all around the world, once you start looking at the local level, at the smaller, at the localized, community-based new economies where production and consumption are linked, you will find projects that demonstrate what I'm saying. And this is why I'm very happy that you are part of World Localization Day. We launched this 3 years ago as a way of celebrating all these initiatives around the world, because people need to know that there's another way forward that is profoundly ethical, that is profoundly wise, that is such a win-win strategy. What it allows is for people to operate in a world where their impact on nature, their impact on other people becomes more visible, becomes clearer. They don't have to have a PhD thesis to read a label in a supermarket to try to understand what has happened to this food, what does it involve, how much exploitation. The more direct relationships allow us to become genuinely more compassionate, and they allow for real wisdom. And I love in Tibetan Buddhism the emphasis on both wisdom and compassion. And remember that we've been warned that wisdom without compassion is dangerous, and compassion without wisdom is also dangerous. What I'm seeing is that as people start connecting, feeling connected to, feeling interdependent with other people and with the plants and the animals on which they depend, they start developing a way of being that goes beyond just abstract concepts. The abstraction of reality, the living by labels, living by words. Even some Western philosophers have warned against this. It's one of the most dangerous mechanisms for creating blind prejudice, and it's a mechanism which is being used now by algorithms in social media and even in the mainstream media, as we start thinking that we know exactly what's going on in China, or that we know what meat eaters are like, or vegans are like, or left or political right. We are becoming more and more embedded in a world where we are using only our left mind and a label that means that, I've decided all Muslims are dangerous, all Buddhists are alternative and wacky. As people start interacting face to face, you will see that so many of these polarities fall away. It doesn't always happen immediately, and I'm not saying that as communities become more interdependent, that is always without problems. Not at all. As I think was mentioned, I helped to start a global eco-village network, and I've been part of seeing how many communities have tried to create this alternative way of living. And I've seen how difficult it can be. Again, I would argue it's partly because we have not paid attention to understanding the global system enough to understand how pressured we are by that system. In order to become genuinely, well, I don't know if I should say genuinely Buddhist, I don't want to be too dogmatic, but I would say in order to move in the direction that we all long to, we all want to have more peaceful relationships. We all want to feel loved and appreciated. We want to feel a sense of belonging. We want to feel a sense of inner peace. And of course, we want to see peace in the outer world. In order for us to do that, I would argue that we do need to look at that bigger picture and to realize that we often fall into traps that keep us on a path of separation, competition, and hyper-individualism. We often reinforce a path about what it is to be successful. We're often pushing our children into schools out of fear that they won't be important if they don't succeed in those very competitive structures. So there's a lot to rethink, but the path of localization, as I said, when it starts even in big cities and of course in more rural areas, the reconnection between people and the people who are producing their food, the reconnection with the land, And the new local food movement is the heart of a broader localization movement, which includes local financing, people coming together, even creating like mini banks in order to collectively shift in the direction they want to. And what gives me so much hope is absolute conviction that we are not in this mess because people are too greedy or because people want just to have more and more consumer goods. What I'm seeing is that people are being pressured to fight to earn enough money to pay for the rent, to pay for their food, and more people are running scared, and they're running faster and faster and faster. That is happening because the global system is pushing that. It's creating wealth for very, very few all around the world and impoverishing the majority. If we can understand a bit more about that and be more compassionate with ourselves and with others, if we can be clearer about where this fear comes from, and if we can be clearer about what we need to do to connect to people, to create more peaceful relationships, I think we can make much more rapid progress. So I don't know how much in your communities there is awareness that another fundamental part of localization is coming together in smaller groups, ideally where you live, so that you can meet up with people who are within reach. And one of the key steps is to have a circle where you communicate from the heart, where you are willing to be vulnerable, where you're willing to be imperfect, where you're willing to talk about your fears or your addictions or your problems. Sharing in a deep, heartfelt way with others is an amazing healing that is fundamentally about the localization I'm talking about. But very often, in order to start that journey, we need to do something that's a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous and other treatment for addiction. What's been discovered is that when people try to go at it alone, it's very difficult. But when they share the journey, they found that this is fundamental to a healing. Why is that? Because we are fundamentally social beings. Now, this is maybe slightly different from some of the thinking in your communities, because I sometimes find a bit too much emphasis in spiritual communities on just the personal inner work. But what we are seeing is that when that's accompanied by the deep connection of the deep sharing in group, we encourage that you do this where you live, so that also over time, people can become real supports for each other. They can support each other in childcare, with illness, in COVID, and this kind of deep sharing and caring in community. That's what localization is, the path to build as a structure, as a way of living. It's not about isolation. It's not about not traveling. It's not about not understanding and getting to know other cultures. It's about creating a way of gaining what we need from nature and from other people, for meeting our needs in a way that is kind, compassionate, based on experiential knowledge, whole knowledge, not just abstract ideas fed to us through big money and big corporations. So I hope that some of this makes sense and that you will join us for World Localization Day, that you will look at the many materials we produce. We have films, we have a localization action guide. We actually haven't developed as much as we want, a guide that would perhaps appeal to you, especially about the inner work. Like I was saying, about this circle sharing, about coming together in local groups. But we are developing materials that we hope all around the world can help people come together again to become part of a community. And as I say, it can happen in cities, it can happen wherever you are. Generally speaking, the totality of a way of life these days is probably more conducive in smaller towns. Very, very key to all of this is scale, is human scale. We need lots of smaller farms, we need lots of smaller towns and cities, but at the moment our governments are pushing to literally push us into bigger and bigger and bigger cities where the McDonald's and the giants can feed us and clothe us. We will never be able to sustain that because it ignores diversity. Diversity is a principle of life. So localization is a path towards respecting and restoring diversity. It's a path to reconnect. It's about reconnection between human and human to nature. So I hope this makes sense. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Helena, thank you so much. That was mind-opening, and I really hope it will inform our community life here in Lerab Ling, and also I pray the whole world can hear your message, your call for change, so thank you. And just to say, we are proud to partner with Helena's organization, Local Future, to celebrate the World Localization Day on 21st of June, and which has a whole really cool month program, so thank you.